I want to tell you about a moment that never made it into a single press conference. No club statement, no official quote dropped on social media. Just a dirt pitch, a kid nobody had ever heard of, and a version of Ronaldinho that the cameras almost never get to see. Here's the surface story everyone thinks they know. A global superstar visits a small community during a break in his schedule, smiles for a few photos, signs a jersey, gets back in the car. That's the version that gets repeated. That's the version that fits neatly into a 30-second clip. But that's not what actually happened here, and by the end of this, you'll understand why this moment became something people in that village still talk about. Let me paint the picture for you. This wasn't a stadium. It wasn't a training ground with cameras lined up behind a rope. This was a stretch of packed dirt on the edge of a small settlement, the kind of pitch held together by two mismatched goalposts and the sheer stubbornness of kids who refuse to stop playing just because the field isn't good enough. That's where football actually lives, by the way, not in the polished academies, not in the boardrooms, on surfaces like that one. Anyone who's spent real time around football at every level knows this truth. The game doesn't care where you learn it. It cares how you fall in love with it. And on that pitch, there was a kid who had fallen in love with one specific thing, the Elastico. That little flick where the ball seems to disappear and reappear on the other foot. The move that made Ronaldinho a global signature before highlight reels were even a regular thing. This kid had no coach teaching him the mechanics. He had grainy footage, a worn-out ball, and hours nobody else wanted to give him. Here's where it gets interesting. The kid wasn't just playing around. He was an orphan, raised by an aunt who could barely keep food on the table, let alone pay for boots that fit. He didn't have a future lined up in football. He had a move he'd taught himself, and a stretch of dirt where, for a few hours a day, none of the rest of it mattered. Now, here's the kicker. Ronaldinho wasn't supposed to be anywhere near that village. The visit was unscheduled, a detour squeezed into a packed week, the kind of stop that exists for 15 minutes on a printed itinerary and is usually forgotten the moment the car pulls away. Except this time, the car didn't pull away. Think about what that means. Established stars don't usually stop for a pickup game on a side street. There's a reason for that. Security, scheduling, liability, all the unglamorous mechanics that govern how athletes move through public spaces. So when someone with that level of profile actually steps out of the routine, it tells you something. It tells you the moment was strong enough to interrupt a system that's specifically built to prevent interruptions. Let me break down exactly why this particular moment had that kind of pull. First, the move itself. The Elastico isn't something you stumble into. It demands a very specific hip rotation, a precise contact point on the ball, and total disregard for how awkward it looks the first 100 times you fail at it. Seeing a kid execute it cleanly, on dirt, with a ball that had clearly seen better years, isn't a coincidence. That's repetition. That's obsession. That's someone who watched the same clip more times than anyone around him probably realized. Second, the setting. There's a difference between a kid showing off a trick in a controlled environment and a kid doing it in the exact kind of place where the move was born. Ronaldinho didn't learn the Elastico on perfect grass either. He learned it on streets and futsal courts, in tight spaces where you either get creative or you get the ball taken off you. Watching that same environment produce the same instinct decades later in someone else's life, that's not nostalgia, that's recognition. Third, and this is the part people miss, the kid wasn't doing it for an audience. He wasn't performing. By every account from people who were there that day, he was just playing, the way kids play when they think nobody important is watching. That's the version of skill that can't be faked or rehearsed. Here's exactly how that matters. Anyone who's been around real talent identification knows that the moment a kid stops performing and starts simply existing inside the move, that's the moment you're looking at something real. There's a fourth piece to this that rarely gets mentioned, and it might be the most important one. Skill on a pitch like that doesn't develop in isolation. It develops because of pressure, the pressure of limited space, of older kids who won't pass you the ball twice if you lose it cheaply, of games that get decided by who can keep possession in a phone booth's worth of room. That kind of pressure either breaks a player's confidence or it forges exactly the kind of improvisation that turns a simple trick into a survival skill. The Elastico isn't decoration in that environment. It's a way of staying on the ball long enough to matter. Anyone who's spent time around academies built on artificial pitches and cone drills knows the difference instantly. You can teach a kid the mechanics of a move in a sterile setting and it will look correct. but it won't carry the same instinct behind it. What that kid on the dirt pitch had wasn't a move he'd been drilled into performing for an audience. It was a move he'd needed, repeatedly, against bigger kids who weren't going to make things easy for him. That's a different kind of education entirely, and it's one that never shows up on a curriculum. There's also the matter of repetition under failure, and that's its own kind of education too. Nobody lands an Elastico cleanly the first 50 times they try it on uneven ground. The ball skips wrong, the footing gives out. You look foolish in front of the same kids you're trying to impress. Most people quit at that stage. The ones who don't are the ones worth paying attention to, because what you're watching isn't talent in the purest sense. It's tolerance for looking bad long enough to eventually look brilliant. That's the quality that real scouting is actually built around, and it almost never announces itself with a label. This is where it gets deeply personal, because what happened next wasn't a 5-minute photo opportunity. The visit stretched on. What was meant to be a quick stop turned into an extended afternoon, the kind that throws off a schedule and makes a security team nervous, because nobody had planned for genuine engagement. There was no script for what was unfolding. That was the moment. That's when the village understood that this wasn't going to be a polite wave from a passing car. You could feel it shift in real time. The stop that was supposed to last 15 minutes had already passed the half-hour mark, and nobody on the side managing the schedule seemed eager to be the one who cut it short. There's an unspoken rule in moments like that. Once a tight schedule has already broken, you let it break properly instead of patching it halfway through. So, instead of the usual quiet word about needing to head out, the afternoon was simply allowed to keep unfolding on its own terms. That decision, small as it sounds, is its own kind of validation. People who manage a player's time for a living develop a sharp instinct for what's worth protecting and what's worth letting go. When they choose to let a moment run long instead of managing it tight, that's not an accident. That's recognition, coming from people who see situations like this constantly and almost never treat one as worth the risk. The whole block came out. Word travels fast in a place that small, and within minutes, what had started with a handful of kids on a dirt pitch became something closer to a community gathering. Mothers came out onto their porches. Older men who hadn't kicked a ball seriously in years found themselves drifting toward the noise. And in the middle of it, a kid who had spent his whole life being overlooked suddenly had the full, undivided attention of the exact person whose move he'd been chasing in secret. Now, here's where it gets even better, because the story doesn't end with attention. It ends with action, and the kind of action that doesn't show up in a highlight reel because there were no cameras built to catch it properly. Just phones held by people whose hands were shaking too much to keep the footage steady. Boots were given, not handed over for a photo and snatched back. Given fully, the way you give something you don't expect to see again. Time was given too. Real time, not staged time. The kind where you can watch someone actually teaching rather than performing a lesson for an audience. And something else was given that mattered more than either of those things. The simple, unmistakable signal that the kid's obsession wasn't ridiculous. It wasn't a waste of time on a dirt pitch with no future in it. It was exactly the kind of obsession that built careers. Let me break down what a quick photo op visit, no matter how well-intentioned, could never have given that kid. It could never have given him proof that the move he'd taught himself actually held up against the person who made it famous. A photo doesn't validate technique. Direct, hands-on attention does. It could never have given him the boots that actually fit. On the actual day his feet were growing out of what he had, instead of some generic donation arriving months later through an anonymous program. It could never have given the rest of that village the same memory. The version where this wasn't charity from a distance, but a real afternoon spent on their own dirt, with their own kids, in their own community. It could never have given the kid's aunt the moment of watching someone with that level of standing in the sport treat her nephew's skill as something worth taking seriously in front of the whole street, instead of as a private kindness easy to dismiss later. And it could never have given the story its staying power. A donation gets forgotten. A photo gets buried in a feed within a week. But an afternoon like that becomes the thing people in that village still bring up years later. The story that gets told to younger kids who never even saw it happen. It could never have replicated the small, almost invisible detail that mattered most to the people who were actually there that day. Nobody rushed the moment along. No one checked a watch. No one mentioned the next stop on the schedule. In a world where a footballer's time gets rationed into tight, carefully guarded blocks, the simple absence of a clock that afternoon said more than any quote ever could have. That's 6 reasons, and honestly, there could be more, but 6 is already enough to make the point. A donation solves a problem for a single day. A visit like this one solves something deeper, something closer to whether a kid is allowed to believe his obsession was ever worth having in the first place. Here's exactly how to think about it. There's a difference between charity and recognition. Charity says, I feel for your situation. Recognition says, what you're doing has value. That village didn't need pity. They needed someone to confirm what they already suspected, that talent doesn't check your address before it shows up. So remember that moment I mentioned at the beginning, the one where the car wasn't supposed to stop, but it did. That's the whole story right there. Not a scheduled stop, not a planned gesture, a genuine interruption caused by a kid who had quietly built something real out of almost nothing on a pitch nobody outside that village had ever heard of. That kid wasn't just lucky that day. He'd already done the part that mattered most, the part nobody can give you. Thousands of repetitions, alone, with a ball that probably should have been replaced a year earlier. What happened on that dirt pitch wasn't luck meeting opportunity. It was preparation finally getting witnessed by the one person who could recognize exactly what he was looking at. Because nobody else walking past that pitch that day would have understood the years of failed attempts hiding behind one clean Elastico. Only someone who'd lived through that exact same obsession could see it for what it actually was. This story didn't need a press release. It didn't need an official statement. It only needed one afternoon, one dirt pitch, and one kid who refused to stop trying, until trying was finally enough. So, there you have it. The real reason that village still talks about this years later isn't because a famous footballer showed up. It's because, for one afternoon, somebody made sure a kid with nothing knew exactly what he had. If you enjoyed this, make sure to like and subscribe for more stories like this one. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.